Chapter 12. The Journal of Clayton Marcells. October 28th, 2049. I awakened to the smell of wood smoke and bacon. I lay for a brief, wondrous time, listening to the sound of morning birds and the soft rustle of leaves as the autumn wind pressed against the side of the tent like a soft nudge to awaken. For that moment, all was calm and beautiful. As I sat up, I was laid siege by a barrage of aches and pains acquired during my tumultuous journey the night before. My overnight bag was in my car, in another state, along with the pain pills that would bring a great deal of relief as I crouched and unzipped the flap of the tent with tight, sore muscles and a neck too stiff to even glance sideways. I crawled on all fours onto the hard ground of the campsite and looked up to see a small fire built in the metal enclosed pit that lay between our tents. The sun was just now rising over the wall of vine-covered oaks which surrounded us, and my companion was seated on a picnic table, cooking on an electric skillet plugged into the site's outlet. My eyes locked on the small electric percolator by the skillet, and noting the steam rising from the spout, I grinned with the thought of hot black coffee. If she had brought a fishing pole, then this would be a perfect vacation. "Bacon sandwich?" she asked, as she sipped from a small metal cup. "Coffee first," I answered as I struggled to straighten the cramped, aching board that was my back. She handed me a cup, which I took gratefully and filled with piping hot Colombian. I blew at the steam and gazed around me at the distant smoke from other camps rising through the trees and chattering squirrels leaping from limb to limb in excited glee. I realized that if I lived here, I would be that enthusiastic about mornings as well. "I suppose we need to talk now," she said, trying to sound cheerful despite the look in her eyes which clearly expressed another sentiment altogether. "That's all right. Whenever you're ready." It occurred to me that I was not at present the least bit interested in diving back into the tangled mess in which I was currently trapped. "It's not that I don't want you to know, Mr. Marcells. Clayton. Clay for short," I said, sitting on the other side of the table, withdrawing several pieces of wheat bread from an open bag and startling crisp pieces of bacon from a deliciously greasy paper towel-covered plate on one. "It's not that I don't want you to know, Clay, but it's all really hard to explain." "I'm very familiar with that feeling," I replied, as I took a crunchy, exquisite bite of my sandwich. "If it makes you feel any better, Miss Houston, Angelica," she said, smiling warmly for the first time since I'd met her. "I'm not even really sure that any of this is happening." She looked at me quizzically with her lovely green eyes. "What do you mean?" I tapped the scar behind my ear. "This thing has been playing games with my head for a long time, and it just gets worse." "Right. The implants can cause perceptual deterioration." "No, they do cause perceptual deterioration, and I am way overdue for a complete mental breakdown. This is real, Clay. It's all really happening." "That's very comforting, Angelica, but that's what all my hallucinations say." "How bad is it?" she asked as she reached across the table, touched my ear gently, sending a warm shiver down my back as she did so. "Well, I've been on antidepressants and antipsychotics now for almost a decade. Even before I got wrapped up in this craziness, I was already double-checking on people I talked to make sure they were real." "Why did you do it?" she asked, as she withdrew her hand and looked at me with interest and maybe a hint of compassion. "I was young, and it was all I ever wanted. People tried to warn me. Hell, my parents begged me not to do it. But computers were my life. Cyberspace fascinated me in a way that real life should have. And with this implant, I knew that I would be set for life. I would always have a job. I would always have money, and I would never really have to think about reality, she finished. I nodded as I took another bite and chewed thoughtfully. I was wrong, though. Most kids are. Most adults are too, for that matter. Reality always creeps in and snags you. My sister was just the opposite, though. She had all the same skills as me, but she was obsessed with reality. She never drank or smoked or did drugs. She worked and paid her bills, took care of her family. When our parents got old, she stepped in and took care of them. When I was at the bottom, she pulled me back to the top. For her, it was the dreams that snuck in. The first time in her life when she got lost in something and the monsters just came out to play. I gazed off into the woods and watched some birds pecking through the leaves and sticks in search of their own breakfast. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, looking down at her hands as she clasped them together as if preparing to pray. I saw something last night, I said, as Neil Kenny's living room reappeared in my mind's window. Neil Kenny's ghostlight scanner came on by itself, and I saw him. Not a recorded image of him, but the other Neil Kenny standing in the room with me. Not only that, but he turned into my sister. He knew everything that she had said on the night she died. I know she didn't kill herself. Somehow, he can turn scanners on and manipulate the images. He touched me. That's impossible, she said, looking up quickly, her hands now tightly clenched. Yeah, just like driving a car through a wormhole from Missouri to Georgia, right? She stared at me in shock, and I thought for a moment I saw her begin to tremble visibly. But how? We've got to tell the Roses. She was standing as if she would run off and find them on foot. I guarantee you that how is in my head as we speak, but the problem is I can't unlock it. That psycho is on Yamashita's payroll, and he killed my sister. Everything that happened in that room last night is recorded on the ghostlight scanner's memory. You don't understand, Clay. This is bigger than just a serial killer using ghostlight for fun and games. If Yamashita has a way to create an actual pocket space between two realities where one can physically affect the other, then they can... What? What is it they're trying to do? They have put a ghost light in every home in the civilized world. Every military organization uses them. Every police station. Hell, even hospitals have them. They can go anywhere and do anything. Anyone can be a target. And if what you said is true, they can make it appear any way they want. Not to mention the complex in Mississippi. They're doing something down by the coast, and no one has a clue. What but us? No one but you. Since you still haven't filled me in. She stopped and looked at me as if suddenly remembering I couldn't read her mind. All right, but I don't even know where to start. She sat back down and seemed to be steadying herself for an intense discussion. How about you start with exactly how you came to be a part of all this? You're not like the others. No goggles for me. I don't remember my past life either, but I think that the Roses know more about it than they let on. So you didn't just awaken into it like they did. When I was a little kid, I got lost at the zoo. I'm not really sure what happened, but I guess I fell asleep and I had a dream. And in the dream, I was following a figure and somehow ended up in some kind of underground chamber talking to a pale woman with white hair. She told me something that I can't remember. And then a huge raven with purple eyes flew out of the shadows and landed on her shoulder. In the dream, I left, and the next thing I knew, my parents found me sleeping on a bench outside the historic section. What on earth did all that mean? I asked as I gulped my cooled coffee and studied the worried fear and confusion that was so twisting the serene quality of her face. I never really knew. I went to school, I grew up, and I started working like I was supposed to. My parents were great people who loved me, and I had great friends, but there was just always something wrong. You weren't happy? I said, trying to remember when I had heard of someone having a decent childhood. It was never about being happy or unhappy. It was about feeling like I was cheating. It's like that feeling you get when you play sick to get out of going to work and you find out that someone got called in on their kid's birthday to cover for you. But this was always worse. It was like I was playing hooky from fate or karma or something. Then one day out of the blue, I get a call from Albright Incorporated wanting to know if I was interested in a job in administration. This great job just fell into my lap. I was there when Ghostlight was just taking off, and the money was unbelievable. I was head over the technical team that was developing Indigo 9 when they called Harris Levine to review some of their findings. I saw everything he wrote about the project, and I knew he was right. So for the first time in my entire life, I put everything on the line, and I contacted him in person. And that's when things got really weird. Levine is a pretty weird guy, I commented, remembering the decontamination booth at his apartment and the way he had blown my world to pieces in one short discussion. He's a genius, Clay, and what he told me changed my life. And what exactly did he tell you? Well, first of all, the son of a bitch had every personal detail about me at his fingertips. And he knew about the dream I had at the zoo because I chatted about it online once when I was 13. He showed me the satellite footage of the vortex over Mississippi and informed me that it was during the same time frame when I had my dream. I don't know why, but I kept on talking to him. Eventually, he introduced me to the Rose brothers. And how did that go? Honestly, it was like meeting old friends. What about Levine? Does he have a past life recall too? No, but he thinks that there's something about the cyber implants that blocks it. It's why Jesse Rose never got one, even though he can run programs in his sleep. I can see how that could happen, I said as she gave me a strange, pitying glance. What? I asked. Nothing. But anyway, it all just started rolling from there. When Yamashita started their project in Mississippi, I immediately transferred to the project. But how did you do it? How did you teleport us? It's the Raven, Clay. I can draw energy from the entity, and one of the gifts it bestows is the ability to use gateway physics. But since its avatar isn't here, all the abilities it grants are limited. Okay, alright. This is where I get off. Avatar? Are you saying it's a god? That's crazy. How could people not have experienced this stuff before? They have, in a way. Shamanistic magic used to be a world religion, Clay. If you go far enough back to the beginning of every world culture, you'll find shamanism and the mythology of these entities. Entities, as in more. There might be more than one of these things. This is why I really didn't want to be the one to have to go into this with you. For whatever reason, in this reality, we have been cut off from a metaphysical truth about the universe. And we compensated by overdeveloping technology. In the world that the Roses reincarnated from, this stuff was a lot closer to the surface. Ryan said that there were psychics who could do all kinds of crazy things that we think of as fiction. These entities are like ambient roaming energy fields that focus through the consciousness of people who are capable of receiving them. They only take on certain forms because that is the shape given to them by the mass unconscious. What you have to understand is that their energy, by its very nature, disrupts the stasis of the known laws of physics. Birds have always been said to be the carriers of the human soul between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They were believed to sit at the gate between the spirit world and ours. So this energy, which creates portals, looks like a raven, I finished for her, as I truly wondered if any of this could possibly be true, even after having experienced the phenomena for myself. So, why don't you have big black bird eyes? Apparently, once you've been touched by the energy of a certain entity, it permanently alters the very makeup of your spirit. So people do have souls then, I said, sounding more sarcastic than I intended. But she disregarded my tone as she continued. Evidently, each human consciousness does in fact have a blueprint which it maintains even after death, or should I say consciousness carries a blueprint which it uses to recreate itself in physical matter. Spiritual DNA, I said, as suddenly, despite the cynicism of my modern mind, it began to make sense. Imagine that DNA is actually a physical representation of something that exists in a metaphysical state, like a universal binary code. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. Poe was really on to something, she said weakly, and waited for me to respond. So, you weren't touched by this raven god, but you can still use its power. Ryan says that in this other world, there were psychics who could borrow energy from any entity without giving themselves over to just one. And you were one of them. I guess so. But that's all that they'll tell me. They say there's a lot that they don't remember, but I think it's more than that. And Ghostlight is a replica of this raven energy? It seems so, yes. And Yamashita is using it to gain control over 2 parallel worlds, and possibly worse. We've got to stop it all, Clay. You can't tamper with space-time like that without some serious consequences. I stared off again at the happy squirrels and wondered if maybe that breakdown wasn't already in full swing. We spent the rest of our morning in awed silence, and I realized that my skills at idle conversation had fallen into the ridiculous under a profound lack of development. Angelica was obviously troubled, and I was just as lost as to how we should proceed. I studied the black ghostlight scanner, which I had sat on the picnic table. I tried to approach the problem analytically. I knew that buried inside the scanner was a connection to an entire network which could be accessed from each individual unit, and yet I was completely incapable of even turning the thing on without alerting our presence to Yamashita. I knew that inside my cerebrum was a locked set of files which could possibly reveal the full scale of Yamashita's plans, but I could not open this Pandora's box without possibly destroying my mind. All we could do was wait. As the sky grew cloudy and the wind grew cool, the happy squirrels disappeared, and soon a drizzle began to fall upon us. We huddled together in Angelica's tent and played cards as the sound of rain skipping over the nylon eventually lulled us into a nap. Neither one of us seemed too concerned about propriety as we curled back to back inside our tiny shelter. And Even with my tremendous ineptitude at social functioning, I knew there was no way I could insinuate any kind of physical interaction without certainly insulting her. I drifted off into troubled sleep, but was awakened by a soft petting on my head. I opened my eyes to find her lean towards me on her elbow, gazing at the scar behind my ear as thunder rolled in the distance. "So this thing causes you a lot of problems," she stated, her warm breath falling on my neck soothingly. "Yeah, always has," I answered, coughing to cover the lilt in my voice. "Does it affect you physically?" Her tone was subtle, but her intent was growing clear. Later we slept, but it was in the depths of early morning that light shone into the campsite. Our ride had finally arrived. As we climbed from the tent, disheveled and shamefaced, I was greeted by the sight of Ryan and Chris standing by the doors of an old model sedan from the 2020s. The headlights were providing an embarrassing spotlight cutting through the fog as we approached the car. "It's about time you guys got here," Angelica said, with a half-hearted attempt to deflect attention from her mussed hair and wrongly buttoned blouse. "It looks like you two kept yourselves occupied," he laughed, as a cloud of cigar smoke drifted from beneath his top hat. "Really, Angelica," Christopher said with false reprimand, "it was only 2 nights. You fell into the sins of the flesh." "And how long was it before you started sitting with that punk girl from the restaurant?" Angelica said accusingly, as we began to collect our gear. "I believe that the vows of chastity do not apply post-mortem," he answered, as the lenses of his goggles zoomed in on her. "Then stop wearing the cassock then," she snapped, with a slight, telling smile. "It's a fashion statement. Besides, the girls love it," he answered, as he returned to his seat in the car. "What the hell is that?" Ryan said as he saw me lugging the ghost light from where I had it stashed in my tent. "Neil Kenny's ghost light." "We have a lot to talk about," I answered as he popped the trunk and I placed it carefully within. Back at the house in Savannah, all were silent as I retold the events of the night in St. Louis. "So, what did Dieter say?" Angelica said as she poured her 3rd glass of wine from the bar in the study where we were all gathered around the fire. "Neil Kenny is dead," Jesse answered from where he leaned against the mantel. "We know that, but no," he interrupted. "The other Neil Kenny is dead too. Or should I say, Dr. Neil Kenny is dead." "He was a doctor?" I visualized the man I had seen standing in the ghost light in St. Louis, and indeed, everything from his black tie and expensive pressed slacks matched the appearance of a doctor. I remembered my dream and recalled his words. "I am a very patient man." Like how a doctor has patience. A bad attempt at play on words, but a subtle hint from my unconscious nonetheless. Yes, a doctor who had a habit of accidentally killing his patients and turned out to be a full-blown serial killer, Ryan explained from his chair. Once again, I remember the words from the dream about how his room used to be quiet and white, like a quiet room in a mental facility for violent residents. He committed suicide at his home after he escaped. Teddy and Esther sat together on the sofa, and I realized only then as Teddy spoke, holding Esther's hands, that they were in fact a couple. "But I saw him in the ghost light," I said, staring out the window at recently planted chrysanthemums standing along the walkway. "You also saw your sister," Esther said without tact. "It's not implausible," Jesse said, scratching his chin, "that there lies at least one answer." "What do you mean?" I turned and walked around the group, grabbing Angelica's wine from her hand and downing it. "We do it all the time. Download entire tracks of personality data into a system and reproduce the identity synthetically. What if between the time the cops got hold of Dr. Kenny and his escape, Yamashita managed to rip his personality into a mainframe and deposit him in the Ghostlight network?" "How does he kill, then?" I asked as I handed the empty glass back to Angelica and went to the bar to find some scotch. Even if a real ghost is very limited in the amount that they can affect physical matter, Chris said sagely as he lifted his cat from the couch beside Esther and cradled it affectionately, there is a whole lot more going on with this ghost-like technology than we know, Ryan said quietly. And it's all in his head, Esther said accusingly as the lenses of her goggles seemed to focus directly on me. And what would you suggest, dear? Teddy said with a hint of sarcasm. Maybe we should just say screw it. Plug him in. See if his head explodes. That is not an option, Angelica said coldly, her eyes locked on Esther. Esther's lenses retracted as she seemed to look down at the floor, chastised. Look, I'm getting bits and pieces of information in my dreams. What if I can access the data that way? I was reaching, I knew, but my options were running thin. Like, how? Hypnosis? Christophorus offered, and all seemed to contemplate this in unison. What about drugs? Ryan said casually to no one in particular. We induce a state of semi-unconsciousness and see if we can dig into the data without actually locking him online and setting off whatever badness they've locked it with. What kind of drugs? Angelica asked protectively, once more making me feel as if she was more than a little concerned for my welfare, a feeling I found very reassuring at the moment. Well, what kind of drugs can cause rapid access to buried unconscious memory? Christophorus sounded intrigued by the prospect. Hallucinogenic, Jesse answered as he looked at me inquisitively. Have you ever tripped before? I looked back at him with sudden uneasiness. No, as the feeling of being a guinea pig began to surface in my gut. I think we can do better than street drugs, Ryan said with what might have passed for reassuring in some other conversation. There are a lot of hypnotics used in psychiatric therapy that might serve us better than an acid trip. If we're going to do this, let's try to at least do it right. Tresferidol, Jesse offered. It's used in the recollection of repressed memories. It's strong, but it's low risk as far as side effects are concerned. We'll have to set him up with some kind of sensory deprivation tank. The upstairs bathroom will have to do, Esther said, sounding uncharacteristically optimistic. Okay. It will take me some time to get some tres, but I think we can probably do this tonight. Ryan stood and walked towards me, taking the glass of scotch from my hand. No more of this stuff, buddy. We gotta be real careful with these hypnotics. You need to eat some lunch and get your head together. You're gonna have to be real zen to pull this off. Turning, he downed the rest of my drink as he withdrew his phone from inside his coat and began making calls. Angelica smiled at me with pity. I know it doesn't seem like it, but they really do know what they're doing. Zen, he says. My head is like a cinema where there's 3 movies are playing at the same time on the same screen. You'll do fine, she said softly, but the doubt behind her words was hard to miss. What passed for a sensory deprivation tank at the Savannah House was an enormous old bathtub that stood on 4 lion's paw legs at each corner. The bathroom was small, dark, and covered in dust, mildew, and cobwebs. As I eased into the warm salt water, Angelica lit candles around the room, and I found myself floating quite comfortably as the shadows danced in the corners beyond the sink and toilet. She handed me 3 tiny white pills and a glass of water, which I nervously took before she placed a black face mask over my eyes and put 2 soundproof plugs into my ears. For this to work effectively, I could have as little sensory input as possible over the next few hours. I lay in the utter silent darkness, floating serenely and waiting for some effect that I could not possibly anticipate. The first thing I noticed was that after what was probably a half hour, I began to lose track of my own anxiety. Despite my mind's attempts to remind me that I was frightened, I gradually became increasingly relaxed and unable to focus on any memory of my environment. I had begun to forget where I was and what I was doing as slow, vivid images started to emerge unbidden into my mind. Then, as if I had stumbled backwards into an earlier point in the day, I was back in the tent making love to Angelica. Every sensation and image was as real and tactile as the actual moment. I could feel her body, smell her hair exactly as it had been the night before. But I could not stop the downward spiral as I descended further through a tunnel of scenes and events. Now I was in St. Louis and running from the police, and a second later I was sitting in the infernal ghost light, confronted by my sister's image. I saw these things with a minimal emotional response, of which I was extremely grateful. I was sinking further down into a bottomless pool of thought and reaction until once more I was in the cyberspace of Yamashita's network, and the data file was there before me, represented now by a sphere of glowing violet light. I had no fear of it. It was simply there and waiting for me to reach in and begin searching through its mysteries. However, even with the sublime drug-induced euphoria, I knew, as I touched its electric, fiery surface, that something was horribly wrong. That was when I was stricken by a blinding, powerful surge of information that made a bolt of lightning seem like a spark from an antique car battery. In one intense explosion, I began plunging into an ocean of numbers and images and data like I had never experienced in all my years working in cyberspace. I felt as if I had just dived from the pinnacle of peace and into an infinity of swarming cosmic insanity. Then, just as it seemed my neurons were going to light up like sparklers in one fiery burst before ultimate disintegration, everything changed. Slowly, the maelstrom began to reconfigure and organize as my brain gave up on assimilating the data and began to reproduce it in patterns and images. Gradually, I returned to a calmer state and watched as I began to journey through flashing scenery, buildings, trees, sky, and ocean. At first, I wrestled with the logistics of the projection before a clear revelation eased me into the truth of this experience. This was no hologram. I was looking at a huge file of recorded data that could be nothing less than a full-scale, in-depth archive of another world. This was someone's personal recorded data on the parallel world with which it was in contact. And the more I saw and learned, the more I became convinced that this was no slightly altered tangent reality. Levine, the roses, and I had missed the target when it came to the comprehension of this other Earth. Yes, on the surface, it resembled our world superficially, in the same way that twins may appear at first glance to be identical. But once you began to scratch the surface and really understand the makeup and continuities of its fabric, there could be no mistaking the inherent difference of its true inner self. I thought of all the traits I had lacked: empathy, social understanding, human responsibility, which had all resided seemingly in my sister, and remembering what Angelica had said about our world compensating for its lack of spirituality with technology, I knew I was coming closer to understanding. This twin Earth was the repository of that metaphysical energy which our world was in deficit. This was no super advanced technological empire trading its secrets to a lesser advanced civilization. We had been deceived. It was all here documented, step by step, in this mysterious sphere of perceptions. Our world was like an outlying frontier on the border of a vast, lifeless, spiritual desert. But this was a coastal community thriving in the excess of a great ocean of energy, more akin to the obliterated Lost World glimpsed through the vortex in 2026, when for one instant the two had made contact.